Hello everyone. Quick question before we get started. What's your favorite way to unwind after a long day? Let me know in the comments. Now, buckle up because today's story is one you won't want to miss. Chapter 1. A Quiet Night Shift. The nights at Metropolitan Correctional Center always felt like they dragged on longer than they should. It wasn't the kind of quiet that calmed you. It was heavy, full of tension that pressed against your chest and whispered that anything could happen when no one was looking. I'd been on the night shift here for 3 years now, and if there was one thing I'd learned, it was that silence in prison wasn't peace. My rounds usually started after the 9 lockdown. The halls, dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights, stretched out like veins through a giant concrete beast. The hum of distant conversations and the occasional shuffle of feet were the only sounds that broke the quiet. Most nights were uneventful, just long hours of patrolling the same corridors, checking the same cells, and nodding at the same guards who looked just as bored and weary as I felt. But tonight felt different. Sean Diddy Combs had been here for months now, and he was nothing like the mogul I remembered from television and magazine covers. Gone were the tailored suits, the diamond-studded watches, and the aura of untouchable wealth. What was left was a man who appeared broken, a shadow of the celebrity who once commanded rooms with his presence. He kept to himself for the most part, shuffling through the day with his head down, avoiding eye contact with inmates and staff alike. In the yard, he was a loner, sitting on the sidelines while others formed their cliques. At meal times, he chose the farthest corner of the cafeteria, always keeping his back to the wall. He had a way of looking small, almost invisible, which was a feat for someone who had once been larger than life. And yet, something about him didn't sit right with me. I'd overheard whispers among the other guards, nothing concrete, just passing comments that hinted at something more beneath the surface. Funny how he always seems to get extra commissary, one had said. Another had mentioned how Diddy managed to avoid the usual scuffles that broke out among inmates, even when tensions were high. It's like he's got some kind of shield around him, they'd joked. I wasn't laughing. As I walked past his cell that night, I noticed him sitting on the edge of his cot, his head bowed, hands clasped together as if in prayer. He didn't move when I passed, but there was an intensity about him that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't fear or sadness. Those were emotions I'd seen countless times in this place. No, this was something else. Focused, calculating. The rest of my rounds were uneventful until I reached the east corridor. That's when I saw her. Officer Daniels was new, barely 6 months into the job. She was young, fresh-faced, and still had that cautious optimism that most of us lost after a few years on the inside. She wasn't like the other guards, who had hardened themselves to the reality of this place. She still smiled at inmates, still tried to make small talk with them when she could. I'd seen her slip extra toiletries to the ones who seemed down on their luck, her gestures always subtle enough to avoid notice from the higher-ups. But tonight, there was something different about her. She was standing outside Diddy's cell, her back to me, her posture stiff. Her hand rested on her hip near her radio, but she didn't use it. She leaned in closer to the bars, speaking in hushed tones. I couldn't make out what she was saying, but the way her shoulders hunched told me she wasn't giving orders. I stepped closer, keeping my footsteps light. "Everything okay here?" I asked, my voice cutting through the quiet like a knife. Daniels jumped, her head snapping around to face me. "Oh yeah, just checking on him," she said quickly, her words tumbling out in a rush. Her smile was forced, too wide, and it didn't reach her eyes. Diddy didn't say a word. He just sat there, staring at me with that same unreadable expression, his hands still clasped like he hadn't moved at all. "Shift's almost over," I said, holding her gaze a moment longer than necessary. "You should get some rest." She nodded, muttering something about heading back to the station before walking away, her pace faster than usual. I watched her go, a nagging feeling settling in my gut. Turning back to Diddy's cell, I found him still staring, his lips curved into the faintest hint of a smirk. It was gone as quickly as it came, leaving me wondering if I'd imagined it. "You need something?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. He shook his head slowly, leaning back against the wall. "Nah, man, I'm good." I lingered for a moment, searching his face for answers I knew I wouldn't get. Then I moved on, but the unease stayed with me. Something about Diddy's behavior didn't add up, and Daniel's reaction only added to the mystery. She was usually composed, confident even in stressful situations. Tonight she'd looked like a deer caught in headlights, and that smirk? What was that about? The rest of the night passed in a blur, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see. As I clocked out at the end of my shift, the memory of Daniels at Diddy's cell played over and over in my mind. Her hurried words, his unsettling calm, and that brief flicker of something I couldn't quite name. For the first time in years, I felt a ripple of genuine fear in this place. Whatever was going on, it wasn't just prison politics or routine corruption. It was something deeper, and I had the sinking feeling that I was about to find out just how deep it went. Chapter 2. The Female Cop. The next time I saw Officer Daniels, the tension from the night before was still etched into her face, though she did a better job of hiding it. She was in the staff break room, sipping coffee out of a chipped mug, her eyes scanning the room like she was waiting for someone to call her out. But no one did. Most of the guards barely looked her way, treating her with the same distant politeness they offered anyone who hadn't yet put in their time. Daniels had been at the Metropolitan Correctional Center for 6 months, maybe 7, and in that time she'd carved out a reputation for herself. Not the loud kind, but the kind that comes with quiet observation. She didn't join in on gossip or let her guard down during shift changes. She kept to herself, doing her job without ruffling feathers. But it was exactly that restraint that made her stand out. There were rumors, of course. There always were in a place like this. Some said she was too soft for the job, that she cared too much about the inmates and not enough about the rules. Others swore she had a temper that could boil over at a moment's notice, though I hadn't seen it myself. What I did notice was how inmates seemed to gravitate toward her, not in the usual predatory way, but cautiously, like they knew she was different. And then there was Diddy. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention to their interactions. They were subtle, too subtle for anyone not looking to catch. A glance exchanged in the yard, a quick word by the vending machines in the common area, the kind of moments that could easily be dismissed as routine if you weren't already suspicious. One afternoon, I saw Daniels walking through the cafeteria, her gaze fixed on the floor as she weaved between tables. It was crowded, noisy, the kind of chaos that could swallow up even the sharpest observer. But I saw it. Diddy was sitting at his usual spot in the far corner, his head bent over his tray as if he were lost in thought. As Daniels passed by, she didn't stop, didn't slow down, but her hand brushed against the edge of his table, just for a second. If I hadn't been watching, I wouldn't have noticed the small slip of paper she left behind, tucked just beneath the rim of his tray. Diddy didn't look up, didn't move to grab it right away. But there was a slight shift in his posture, a tension that told me he was aware. When Daniels was gone, he casually adjusted his tray, his movements so natural it was like watching an artist at work. The paper disappeared into his sleeve, and no one else seemed to notice. By the time I caught up with Daniels later that shift, she looked as unbothered as ever. She was patrolling the east wing, her hands resting lightly on her belt, her expression blank. But when I called her name, there was a flicker, just a moment, where her calm cracked. "Hey, Daniels," I said, keeping my tone casual. "You good? You've been looking a little tired lately." She hesitated, then shrugged, her smile tight. "Night shifts will do that to you." "You sure that's all it is?" I pressed. Her eyes flicked past me, scanning the corridor like she was making sure no one else was listening. "Yeah, I'm fine, just busy." It wasn't much of an answer, but it was enough to confirm my suspicion. She was hiding something. As the days went on, I started asking around, quietly piecing together bits of her backstory. Daniels had transferred from a smaller facility upstate, one of those rural prisons where the population was low and the stakes were even lower. She'd come here, people said, because she needed the money. Something about student loans or family debts. Whatever the reason, she jumped at the chance to work at a higher-paying facility, even if it meant dealing with the kind of high-profile inmates most guards would rather avoid. "They're solid," one of the senior guards told me when I brought her up during a coffee break. "Does her job, keeps her head down, maybe a little too eager to please, but that's not unusual for newbies." "What about her and Diddy?" I asked, keeping my tone light. The guard gave me a curious look. "What about them?" "I've seen them talking," I said, "more than you'd expect." He frowned, leaning back in his chair. "You sure about that? Daniels doesn't strike me as the type to cross any lines." "Maybe not," I said, though the image of her slipping that note under Diddy's tray lingered in my mind. By the end of the week, the pieces were starting to come together, though the picture they formed wasn't clear. Daniels was careful, deliberately so, but there were cracks in her facade, little moments where her composure slipped just enough to reveal the stress beneath. She jumped when people approached her from behind. She avoided conversations about Diddy, deflecting questions with practiced ease. And more than once, I caught her sneaking nervous glances over her shoulder, like she was expecting someone or something to catch up with her. The whispers among the inmates grew louder too. They noticed the same things I did, though their interpretations varied. Some said she was working with Diddy, smuggling notes or favors in exchange for money or protection. Others thought she was just scared, trapped in a situation she couldn't get out of. And then there were the darker theories. "She's not here by choice," one inmate told me when I pressed him for details. "Someone's got something on her, maybe Diddy, maybe someone else, but she's stuck." "Stuck how?" I asked, leaning in closer. He shook his head. "I don't know, man, but you don't look at people like that unless you're scared of them, and I've seen the way she looks at him." That comment stayed with me long after my shift ended. Was Daniels an ally, a victim, or something in between? The more I watched, the more I realized I couldn't tell, but one thing was clear: Diddy wasn't as helpless as he seemed. And Daniels, whatever her role was, wasn't just another guard doing her job. Chapter 3: The Midnight Encounter. Nights in the Metropolitan Correctional Center have a way of stretching time, turning minutes into hours and hours into an eternity. The stillness was unnerving, broken only by the occasional creak of footsteps or the faint murmur of restless inmates. For most guards, the graveyard shift was a monotonous purgatory, but for me, it had become a window into a hidden world where secrets lurked in the shadows. It was just past midnight when I saw her. Officer Daniels. She wasn't supposed to be there, at least not in that section. The restricted area near Diddy's cell was off limits to anyone not specifically assigned to it, and Daniels wasn't on the roster for the night. Yet, there she was, moving with a purpose that made my pulse quicken. She walked with her head down, her movements calculated but hurried. I slipped into a nearby alcove, my breath catching in my throat as I watched her glance over her shoulder. Her hand lingered near the radio clipped to her belt, as if she were prepared to make an excuse if someone confronted her. But no one did. I followed at a distance, careful to keep my footsteps silent against the cold concrete floor. My mind raced with possibilities. Was she delivering something to Diddy, a message, contraband? Or was this just another piece of the puzzle I couldn't yet see? Daniel stopped in front of Diddy's cell, her back to me. The dim light cast long shadows across the corridor, obscuring her movements, but I could see enough to know she wasn't there for a routine check. Diddy was sitting on the edge of his cot, his posture relaxed, almost indifferent. The helpless act he wore during the day was gone, replaced by a calm confidence that sent a chill down my spine. He didn't speak right away, just watched Daniels with an intensity that made the air feel heavier. Daniels reached into her pocket, pulling out a small object. It glinted briefly in the light before she slipped it through the bars, her hand lingering for a moment as if to ensure he had taken it. Diddy's fingers closed around it, his movements slow and deliberate. "What's the status?" he asked, his voice low but carrying an edge of command that I hadn't heard before. Daniels glanced around, her body tense. "It's set," she whispered, "but we don't have much time. You need to—" Her words trailed off as Diddy raised a hand, silencing her. "We'll discuss it later. Just make sure everything's ready." I pressed myself closer to the wall, straining to catch every word. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. Whatever they were talking about, it wasn't the kind of conversation you'd expect between an inmate and a guard. Daniels nodded, her expression unreadable. "You'd better hope this works," she muttered, her voice barely audible. "They will," Diddy said, his tone laced with certainty. "You just need to trust me." For a moment, neither of them moved. The tension in the air was palpable, like the moment before a storm breaks. Then, without another word, Daniels turned and started down the corridor. I ducked back into the alcove, holding my breath as she passed by. Her face was pale, her jaw clenched, and for a fleeting second, her eyes darted toward me. It was so quick I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it, but the flicker of fear, or guilt, in her expression was unmistakable. She kept walking, her pace quickening as she disappeared around the corner. I waited a moment longer, my mind reeling, before stepping out of my hiding spot. The corridor was empty now, save for the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the distant echo of footsteps. What had I just witnessed? Diddy's cell was just a few steps away, his silhouette visible through the bars. He didn't acknowledge me, his gaze fixed on something I couldn't see. His calmness was unnerving, a stark contrast to the desperate facade he displayed during the day. For a second I considered confronting him, demanding to know what was going on, but the weight of what I'd just seen held me back. If Daniels was involved in something illicit, and Diddy was at the center of it, then calling them out now would do nothing but put a target on my back. Instead, I turned and walked away, my mind racing with questions. What had Daniels given him? A key? A note? Something else entirely? And what did Diddy mean when he said everything was set? By the time I reached the staff quarters, my hands were shaking. The quiet monotony of the night shift had shattered, replaced by a gnawing sense of unease. Daniels wasn't just another guard doing her job. She was part of something bigger, something dangerous. And Diddy, whatever facade he'd been hiding behind, was far from powerless. For the first time, I felt the weight of the secrets this prison held, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see. Chapter 4. The Dual Persona. It started as a whisper, a stray comment here, a rumor there, nothing concrete, nothing you could pin down, but enough to feel like there was more to Diddy than met the eye. For weeks, I'd been watching him play the role of the downtrodden prisoner. Slouched shoulders, downcast eyes, a man brought low by scandal and incarceration. But now, I couldn't unsee the cracks in the facade. The first real clue came during a coffee break with Jenkins, one of the older guards. Jenkins had been at the Metropolitan Correctional Center long enough to know every trick in the book. He didn't mince words, especially when it came to inmates who thought they could game the system. "Diddy's got everyone fooled," he muttered, stirring creamer into his coffee. "You think he's just another celebrity broken by the system? Nah, he's running his own little empire in there." I raised an eyebrow, playing dumb. "What do you mean?" Jenkins leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Better meals, extra rec time, contraband you wouldn't believe. And don't even get me started on the inmates. Half of them idolize him, the other half won't even say his name. That kind of power doesn't come from being a washed-up celebrity." It wasn't just Jenkins. Over the next few days, I started noticing things I'd overlooked before. Diddy's cell always seemed a little cleaner than the others, his meals a little more generous. He rarely stood in line for anything. Other inmates would bring him what he needed, whether it was a book, a snack, or even just a word of gossip. It wasn't overt, but it was there, like a current running beneath the surface of the prison. One inmate, a wiry guy named Torres, summed it up best during a routine check. "You don't mess with Diddy," he said, his voice low and wary. "Man's got reach. You think he's just sitting here, biding his time? Nah, he's still pulling strings." "But how?" I pressed, keeping my tone casual. "What kind of strings can a guy like him pull from in here?" Torres just shook his head, his eyes darting to the guard station at the end of the block. "Doesn't matter. He gets what he wants, always has, always will." And then there was Daniels. At first, I'd tried to convince myself that her interactions with Diddy were coincidental, the kind of minor infractions that happen when a guard gets too familiar with an inmate. But the more I watched, the harder it became to ignore the pattern. She wasn't just bending the rules, she was breaking them. And she wasn't doing it out of kindness. I started to notice the way she carried herself during her rounds. Her shoulders were always tense, her eyes constantly scanning the room. She spoke less and less to her fellow guards, retreating into a kind of self-imposed isolation. When she did talk, her words were clipped, her tone defensive, as if she were constantly bracing for a fight. One evening, I caught her near the staff lockers, staring at her reflection in the scratched mirror. Her hands were trembling as she adjusted her uniform, and for a brief moment, I saw something raw and unguarded in her expression. "Daniels?" I said, my voice softer than usual. "You okay?" She flinched, her eyes snapping to mine. "Fine," she said quickly, too quickly. "Just tired." But it wasn't just fatigue. The more I observed, the more I realized she was caught in something bigger than herself. Whether she was helping Diddy out of loyalty, fear, or some kind of twisted sense of obligation, I couldn't tell. But one thing was clear, she wasn't in control. And neither was I. By the end of the week, I'd pieced together enough to paint a rough picture. Diddy's helpless act was just that, an act. He wasn't just surviving prison, he was thriving in his own quiet way, manipulating the system and the people around him to maintain his influence. The inmates who idolized him did so out of awe for his power. Those who feared him did so because they knew what he was capable of. And Daniels? She was as the missing piece, the bridge between Diddy's old world and his new one. Whether she'd been coerced or manipulated, I couldn't say. But her involvement wasn't just incidental. It's deliberate. The realization left me feeling hollow. For weeks, I'd told myself I was just an observer, a neutral party documenting the strange dynamics of prison life. But now, I felt complicit. I'd seen too much to pretend otherwise, but not enough to take action without risking my own safety. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I thought about reporting what I'd seen. I imagined walking into the warden's office, laying out the facts and watching as the weight of the system crushed Diddy's little empire. But the fantasy crumbled as quickly as it formed. I'd seen what happened to people who stuck their necks out in places like this. Retaliation wasn't just a possibility, it was a certainty. And so I stayed silent, my doubts gnawing at me like a sickness. But even as I tried to convince myself to leave it alone, one thought kept circling back in my mind. If Diddy was willing to go to these lengths to maintain control, what was his endgame? And how far would he go to keep it hidden? Chapter 5. A terrifying revelation. There's a point where suspicion turns into certainty, and that point hit me like a freight train one cold, quiet evening. Up until now, I'd been piecing together fragments of a puzzle, but I hadn't expected to find the picture staring back at me so clearly. It started with a slip of paper. I was making my rounds, keeping an eye on Diddy's cell from a safe distance when I noticed something unusual. Daniels, quiet, guarded Daniels, had paused near his door, her hand slipping through the bars as if handing him something. She lingered for just a moment, her head tilted slightly as if waiting for confirmation. Then, with a quick glance over her shoulder, she walked away. I waited until her footsteps faded down the hall before moving closer. The paper was gone. Diddy had tucked it away the moment she'd left. But his demeanor told me everything. The slouched shoulders, the meek, defeated expression he wore in front of guards were gone. In their place was a man who exuded calm control, like a king surveying his kingdom. That interaction stuck with me all night, eating away at the edges of my resolve. By the next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to dig deeper, and that's when I found it. While reviewing the surveillance logs, a task I'd taken on under the guise of routine protocol, I stumbled upon a snippet of footage that made my blood run cold. It was grainy and poorly lit like all prison cameras, but the scene was unmistakable. Daniels had been meeting with Diddy in the far corner of the rec yard, well away from the prying eyes of other inmates or guards. The footage showed her handing him what looked like a small package, her expression tense and serious. Diddy, for his part, appeared relaxed, even smug, as he tucked the package into his waistband and gave her a curt nod. I played the footage back 3 times, each replay sinking the truth further into my chest like a lead weight. This wasn't just casual conversation or a passing favor. This was coordinated, deliberate, evidence of a connection far deeper than I'd feared. The more I watched, the more the pieces began to fit together. The rumors, the whispered conversations, Daniels's jumpy demeanor, it all made sense now. But there was one piece I still couldn't figure out. Why? Why would someone like Daniels, who seemed so desperate to avoid trouble, get involved in something like this? The answer came later that day, in the form of a voice recorder tucked into her locker. It wasn't unusual for guards to carry personal recorders, especially those new to the job, but what I found on hers was anything but standard. The recorder had been left running, whether by accident or design, and the playback revealed a conversation that made my stomach turn. "Don't have a choice," Daniel's voice whispered, barely audible over the hum of the background noise. "You always have a choice," came a low, steady voice I recognized instantly as Diddy's. "But some choices are better than others. You wouldn't want anything to happen to your sister, would you?" There was a pause, filled only with the sound of someone's breath hitching, a sound that could only be described as fear. "You're a smart woman," Diddy continued, his tone almost soothing. "Do what I ask, and everything stays nice and calm. Your family stays safe. You get to keep your job. Everybody wins." The recording ended abruptly, but it was enough, more than enough. Daniels wasn't just helping Diddy out of loyalty or greed. She was trapped, coerced into playing a role she couldn't escape. And the worst part was, I knew she wasn't the only one. Diddy's reach, his ability to manipulate and control even from behind bars, was staggering. The man who acted like a broken shell in public was nothing short of a puppeteer, pulling strings not just within the prison, but potentially beyond it. The realization sent a chill down my spine, but it also lit a fire in my gut. Someone needed to do something, and yet, as I gathered my thoughts and steeled my resolve, I couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread in the pit of my stomach. That dread turned to full-blown fear later that evening, when I decided to confront Daniels directly. I waited until she was alone in the break room, her back to the door as she stared into her coffee like it held all the answers she couldn't find. "Daniels," I said softly, stepping into the room. She jumped, her eyes wide with surprise. And something else. Guilt. Fear. Maybe both. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice sharp but trembling. "I know what's going on," I said, keeping my tone low and measured. "I know about Diddy, the notes, the meetings, the package in the yard. I've seen the footage." Her face went pale, and for a moment I thought she might faint. But then her expression hardened, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "You don't understand," she hissed. "You have no idea what he's capable of." "Then help me understand," I pressed. "Tell me why you're doing this. Tell me what he has on you." Daniel's eyes darted to the door, her voice dropping to a near whisper. He knows things. About my family. About me. If I don't do what he says. She trailed off, shaking her head as if the thought alone was too much to bear. You can't let him control you, I said, stepping closer. We can go to the warden. We can... No, she interrupted, her voice suddenly firm. You don't get it. He's not just some washed-up celebrity. He's connected. Out there, in here, it doesn't matter. He always gets what he wants. Her words hung in the air, heavy with a truth I couldn't deny. And then, just as I was about to press further, she looked me square in the eye and said the words that sent a shiver down my spine. Stay out of it, for your own good. The fear in her voice was real, but so was the warning. I left the break room with more questions than answers, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of everything I'd uncovered. Diddy's influence wasn't just a theory anymore, it was fact. But the more I learned, the more I realized how dangerous it was to keep digging. And yet, I couldn't stop. Not now. Not when the stakes were this high. Chapter 6. The Power Play. Prison is supposed to be a place of order, with rules that govern every interaction and keep chaos at bay. But there was nothing orderly about the way Diddy moved through the Metropolitan Correctional Center. For someone locked in a cage, his reach was astonishing and terrifying. It started with little things, moments you'd miss if you weren't paying attention. Inmates stepping aside when he passed in the yard, their heads down as though avoiding his gaze. Conversations would stop abruptly when he entered a room, replaced by an eerie silence that lingered long after he left. Even the most defiant prisoners, the ones who challenged every authority figure in the building, seemed to tread carefully around him. I watched it all unfold, my unease growing with each passing day. Diddy's behavior didn't match the helpless facade he'd perfected for the guards and media. During the day, he slouched in his cell, projecting the image of a man broken by his circumstances. But at night, the mask slipped, revealing someone who wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. One evening I caught sight of him in the rec room. He wasn't playing cards or lifting weights like the others. Instead, he was seated at a corner table, surrounded by a group of inmates who looked more like a council than a gang. They leaned in close as he spoke, their expressions a mix of deference and unease. Whatever he was saying, they were hanging on every word. As I moved closer, trying to catch snippets of their conversation, Diddy glanced up. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I felt a chill run down my spine. His gaze wasn't hostile, but it wasn't friendly either. It was the look of someone who knew he held the upper hand and wanted you to know it too. The guards weren't immune to his influence either. I noticed how they handled him differently from the others, their tones more measured, their interactions laced with a subtle undercurrent of caution. Some even seemed to go out of their way to accommodate him, whether it was by extending his recreation time or turning a blind eye to minor infractions. At first, I chalked it up to his celebrity status. After all, this was Sean Diddy Combs. But the more I observed, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about fame. It was about control. One night I overheard two guards talking in the break room. Their voices were low, but the tension in their words was unmistakable. "I'm telling you, man, he's got something on Jenkins," one of them said, his tone urgent. "No way that guy's letting him get away with this stuff otherwise. Or maybe Jenkins is just smart enough to know when to stay out of it," the other replied. "Diddy's not someone you cross. Not in here, not out there." The conversation confirmed what I'd suspected all along. Diddy wasn't just a prisoner. He was a player in a game that most of us didn't even realize we were part of. And then there was Daniels. The pressure on her was becoming more obvious by the day. She was jumpier than ever, flinching at loud noises and avoiding eye contact with anyone who tried to talk to her. She'd started working longer hours, volunteering for shifts no one else wanted, as if trying to keep herself too busy to think. But no matter how hard she tried to hide it, the cracks were showing. I caught her in the corridor one afternoon, her hands shaking as she fumbled with a stack of paperwork. When she saw me, her eyes darted to the floor, her face flushing with guilt. "Daniels?" I said, keeping my tone neutral. "You okay?" "Fine," she replied quickly, her voice a little too sharp. "Just tired, that's all." "You don't look fine," I pressed, stepping closer. "If there's something going on—" "There's nothing going on," she snapped, cutting me off. But her voice cracked on the last word, betraying the weight she was carrying. I let it go, but the encounter left me more convinced than ever that Daniels was in over her head. Whatever hold Diddy had on her, it was tightening, and I wasn't sure how much longer she could take it. The turning point came later that night. I was making my rounds when I noticed a commotion near Diddy's cell. 2 inmates were arguing loudly, their voices echoing down the corridor. One of them, a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek, was gesturing wildly, his anger palpable. "You think you can just take whatever you want?" he shouted, his voice filled with venom. "You don't run this place." Diddy didn't respond immediately. He remained seated on the edge of his cot, his posture relaxed, his hands resting casually on his knees. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm, almost bored. "I don't run this place," he said, his voice carrying just enough edge to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "But I don't need to. People like you make it easy." The scarred man lunged forward, but before he could reach Diddy, 2 other inmates stepped in, grabbing him by the arms and dragging him back. They didn't say a word, but their actions spoke volumes. Diddy didn't need to fight his own battles. He had people willing to do it for him. As the scarred man was hauled away, Diddy leaned back against the wall, a faint smirk playing on his lips. It wasn't the expression of a man who felt threatened. It was the expression of someone who knew he'd already won. Watching him in that moment, I realized just how deep his influence ran. This wasn't just about contraband or favors, it was about power. Diddy had found a way to thrive in an environment designed to strip people of their humanity. He wasn't just surviving, he was ruling, and everyone else was playing by his rules. As I walked away, my thoughts raced. Diddy's act of helplessness during the day was a carefully crafted illusion, designed to disarm the people who might challenge him. But at night, the truth came out. He was a puppeteer, pulling strings I hadn't even realized existed. And the more I uncovered, the more I began to fear that I was tangled in those strings too. Chapter 7. A Dangerous Game. In prison, danger isn't always loud and obvious. It's quiet, creeping into the corners of your mind, feeding on your fears. I'd seen enough to know when someone was sending a message. But this wasn't just a warning, it was a challenge. And it was coming from someone who didn't like the questions I was asking. The first thread arrived in my locker, tucked between my personal notes and a worn clipboard. A single sheet of paper, the words scrawled in thick black marker, "Stop digging." No signature, no explanation, just the blunt warning. It didn't feel like the usual prison games. This was deliberate, calculated. Someone knew I was paying attention, and they didn't like it. I dismissed it at first. Threats like that weren't uncommon in a place like this. But then the second one came. This time it wasn't a note. As I walked back from the staff restroom, I found my chair tipped over, its legs snapped clean in half. It was an absurd gesture, almost theatrical, but the message was clear. Back off, or things will escalate. I tried to act unfazed, even as the unease settled in my stomach. But when Daniels approached me in the corridor that evening, her pale face and darting eyes told me the stakes were higher than I thought. "We need to talk," she whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, steering her toward a quieter corner of the break room. Her hands were shaking as she clutched a file folder to her chest, her usual composure replaced by a barely concealed panic. "What's going on, Daniels?" I asked, keeping my voice calm despite the growing knot in my chest. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice barely audible. He's got too much power. I thought I could handle it, but He knows things. About me, my family. Her words came out in a rush, each one laced with desperation. She looked like she was about to collapse under the weight of whatever she was holding back. "What does he have on you?" I pressed, trying to steady her. Daniels hesitated, her eyes darting toward the door. "It doesn't matter," she said finally. "I'm trapped, and so are you if you don't stop." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd suspected Diddy's reach extended beyond his cell, but hearing it from Daniels made it all the more real. She wasn't just a pawn in his game, she was a victim, like so many others. And now, so was I. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to stretch too far. Every noise felt amplified. The prison, already suffocating, felt like it was closing in on me. Even my fellow guards seemed distant, their conversation stopping abruptly when I walked into the room. Was it paranoia? Or had Diddy managed to turn them? The breaking point came the next day during my rounds. As I passed Diddy's cell, he looked up from his bunk, his face unreadable. There was no smirk, no flash of arrogance, just a calm, calculated stare that sent a chill down my spine. "Enjoying yourself?" he asked, his tone casual but heavy with implication. I stopped, meeting his gaze. "Just doing my job." His lips curled into a faint smile. "Careful how deep you dig," he said. "You might not like what you find." The words hung in the air long after I walked away. It wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. And it confirmed what I already knew. Diddy wasn't just aware of my investigation. He was orchestrating it, letting me get close enough to feel the danger without ever revealing his hand. Later that evening, as I reviewed my notes in the small office I shared with 2 other guards, I found another message. This one wasn't subtle. Scrawled across my desk in red marker were 2 words: "Stay silent." I stared at the message, my pulse pounding in my ears. Whoever left it hadn't bothered to be discreet. They wanted me to know they'd been here, that they could reach me whenever they wanted, and they wanted me to feel afraid. But it wasn't fear that consumed me. It was anger. Anger at Diddy, at the system that allowed him to thrive, at the silence that protected him. Anger at myself for even considering backing down. That's when Daniels appeared in the doorway, her expression a mix of fear and resolve. "He's watching you," she said, her voice low. "You need to stop." I looked at her, my jaw tight. "I can't." "You don't understand," she insisted. "He's not just pulling strings here. He's got people outside, people who can make you disappear." Her words sent a chill down my spine, but I refused to let it show. "If I stop, he wins," I said, "and you're still trapped." Daniels shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "You don't know what he's capable of." "I don't care," I said, my voice firm. "Someone has to stand up to him." For a moment, Daniels said nothing, her shoulders slumping under the weight of her fear. Then, with a shaky breath, she nodded. "Be careful," she said. "You don't know how deep this goes." As she left the room, I felt a strange sense of clarity. I was in over my head, yes, but I wasn't going to stop. Diddy's power might have reached further than I'd imagined, but that didn't make him untouchable. It just meant the stakes were higher. The next morning, I made my decision. I wasn't going to stay silent. I wasn't going to let fear control me. If Diddy wanted to play games, I was ready to play back. And so, as I approached his cell later that day, my heart pounding and my fists clenched, I knew there was no turning back. It was time for answers. It was time to confront the man who had turned the prison into his own personal kingdom. Whatever happened next, I was ready. Chapter 8. The Unseen Truth. The tension in the air was thick as I approached Diddy's cell. My footsteps echoed down the dimly lit corridor, each step steady despite the storm raging inside me. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was a gamble. I was walking into a lion's den, fully aware of the risks but unwilling to back down. I had to know the truth, even if it meant stepping into the shadows of a game far beyond my control. When I reached his cell, Diddy was sitting on his bunk, his posture unnervingly relaxed. He looked up as I stopped in front of him, his eyes sharp and calculating. Gone was the helpless, broken man he pretended to be during the day. This was the real Sean Diddy Combs, the puppeteer behind the curtain. "You look like you've got something to say," he said, his voice smooth, almost amused. "I want answers," I said, keeping my tone steady. "No more games." He chuckled, a low, unsettling sound that sent a chill down my spine. "Answers? That's a dangerous thing to want in a place like this." I stepped closer, gripping the bars. "You've been playing everyone here, the inmates, the guards, even the system. And Daniels, what have you done to her?" His expression didn't change, but I caught the briefest flicker of something in his eyes, amusement, maybe even pride. "Daniels is a good soldier," he said. "She understands how things work." "She's terrified of you," I shot back. "She's trapped and you know it." Diddy leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You think you're the first person to come at me like this? You think you're different? You're not. You're just another piece on the board, and the sooner you realize that, the better." I ignored the warning in his tone, pushing forward. "What's your end game? What are you trying to do here?" He leaned back again, a sly smile spreading across his face. "You ever hear the saying, the best moves are the ones no one sees coming? That's all this is, a move, a step in a much bigger game." I clenched my fists, frustration boiling under the surface. He was toying with me, giving me just enough to keep me hooked, but not enough to piece it all together. "And Daniels?" I pressed. "What's her role in your game?" His smile faltered, just for a moment. "Daniels made her choices," he said. "No one forced her into anything." "That's not what it looks like," I said. "She's scared out of her mind. If you've got something on her, if you're threatening her." "You think I need to threaten people?" he interrupted, his voice sharper now. "People like Daniels, they do what they do because they see the writing on the wall. They know where the power is, and they know how to survive." There it was, the admission, veiled in arrogance but unmistakable. Diddy didn't need to coerce anyone. His power came from the fear and desperation he cultivated, from the unspoken knowledge that crossing him came with consequences. I stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. This wasn't just about him or Daniels or even the prison. It was about something bigger, an entire system built on manipulation, secrecy, and control, and I was standing in the middle of it, trying to make sense of a puzzle that had no edges. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked finally. "Why not just shut me down like everyone else?" Diddy's smile returned, colder this time. "Because it doesn't matter," he said. "You can write your little notes, tell your little stories, but in the end, nothing changes. The system eats people like you alive." He stood then, stepping closer to the bars, his presence looming despite the metal barrier between us. "So go ahead," he said, his voice low. "Expose me. Tell the world. But just remember, whatever happens next, that's on you." I held his gaze, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment I saw the truth in his eyes. Not just the man he was, but the machine he represented. Diddy wasn't just a player in the game. He was the game. As I turned to leave, I caught sight of Daniel standing at the end of the corridor. She looked at me, her face pale and drawn, but there was something else there too. A glimmer of hope, or maybe regret. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but then closed it, turning away before I could say anything. I walked out of the prison that night feeling heavier than I ever had before. I'd gotten my answers, but they hadn't brought clarity. If anything, they'd only deepened the shadows. Back in my cramped apartment, I spread my notes across the table, trying to make sense of it all. The threats, the manipulation, the quiet power Diddy wielded. It all pointed to a truth too big to grasp. This wasn't just about one man. It was about a system that thrived on silence and fear, a system that protected the powerful while crushing those who dared to resist. And yet, I couldn't let it go. I couldn't walk away, not completely. There were still too many unanswered questions, too many pieces of the puzzle that didn't fit. What was Daniels really hiding? How far did Diddy's influence reach? And most importantly, what would happen if I tried to expose it all? As I sat there, staring at the chaos of my notes, one thought kept running through my mind. What if Diddy was right? What if the system really was too big, too powerful to fight? But then I thought of Daniels, of the fear in her eyes and the hope buried beneath it. And I realized that even if I couldn't win, even if the truth wouldn't change anything, it still mattered. Because sometimes the only way to fight the darkness is to shine a light, even if it's just a flicker.